of introducing Jeff Sachs. He is one of the world's most perceptive and original analysts of global development. Professor Sachs is the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University and a leading expert on socioeconomic development and the fight against poverty. Among the many seminal publications that he has done, he is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, which means that he does not only write for his academic peers, but also in a way that interested laypersons can understand and can react to. His most recent book I particularly recommend to you, that's The Age of Sustainable Development. It's a landmark publication and a clarion call for all who care about our planet and global justice. Jeff Sachs was named twice to be one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, and he was recently awarded the Blue Planet Prize for his contributions to solving global environmental problems. Professor Sachs is a special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals and the co-founder and chief strategist of the Millennium Promise Alliance, a non-profit organization dedicated to ending extreme poverty and hunger. He is also the director and the initiator of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Now, this you can all read at Wikipedia, but there is much more to Jeff Sachs. I had the pleasure of working with Jeff in the field, and I felt the human warmth with which he met people living in absolute poverty. I experienced his humanistic zeal and total humanitarian dedication. Jeff Sachs is not only a great scientist and a vigorous political activist, but he's a wonderful human being, and I'm very grateful, Jeff, that you took the time to be with us this evening. Professor Sachs will talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions for another 15 minutes. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Thank you for that very warm introduction, and especially for the invitation to be together with all of you. And thank you for the University of Basel for hosting this very important World Sustainability Forum for 2015. I am most honored and pleased that I have a chance to be with you just at this moment. We are within days now of having the development goals adopted. September 25th is the date that the gavel will come down and world leaders will, we hope, set us on a new course. And as you all know very well, the first test of those Sustainable Development Goals will come just a few weeks after the September UN Summit, when the world will gather in Paris at COP21. Now, in the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 13 commits all of the world's governments to combat and curb human-induced climate change. And if they're serious, when they meet just a few weeks later at the UN Framework Conference of Parties, they will reach what would be the most important and historic agreement on climate change since the adoption of the Framework Convention itself at the Earth Summit in 1992. I'm very happy to be with you because I want to convey one message, one belief of mine, and that is that these new Sustainable Development Goals are important. That may not be self-evident. Maybe it is self-evident, and I apologize for taking your time, but for many people in the world, they will not, first of all, know much about these goals, I really want to spend the time with you this evening to say that these goals can make a vital difference. Indeed, I can't think of any other way for us to achieve sustainable development but through having globally agreed goals like the ones that we're about to adopt in September, the 25th of September. So I'm a believer in these pieces of paper. I'm a believer in UN declarations. And I want to spend the time to say why that's the case, because many people think that the UN is just vapor. Easy to say things, not really to achieve them. What difference can yet another high-minded statement make? But I'm close to the 5th year of being the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the Millennium Development Goals, which have been in operation for 15 years since they were adopted at the Millennium Summit. So I do feel that I've had a perspective, probably a privileged view, to see to what extent high-minded aspirations adopted by the UN General Assembly have the potential to make a difference. And my verdict is that the Millennium Development Goals have made a difference. They certainly haven't accomplished all that they could have accomplished. They have not accomplished all that they should have accomplished. They have not accomplished all that they were promoted to accomplish back in September 2000. But they made a difference. And they made a difference in a way that teaches us a lot about how we can use the SDGs for even bigger achievements. That's really what I want to discuss. So I have a PowerPoint. I'm not sure how exactly we're going to coordinate on this, but the first of the sections of my talk is called Getting to Know the SDGs. And my first recommendation to you is that you learn the 17 SDGs by heart. When you go home this evening, you become the first in your family to know them. You impress everybody at work tomorrow that you can say what SDG 14, SDG 7, SDG 3, and all the rest are. I think it's important for you to know the SDGs. Now, what I point out in the next slide is that the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals came in the Rio Plus 20 Summit in June 2012. So let me give you the framework just to remind you. June 2012 was the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit. And as UN processes go, these anniversaries are marked by global follow-up conferences. So, in fact, the Rio Earth Summit was the 20th anniversary of the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Stockholm in 1972. Then came the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and the Rio Plus 20 Summit was in June 2012. It was, in its way, a rather somber gathering, because the Rio Earth Summit was supposed to be the breakthrough of sustainable development, after all. In fact, the Rio Summit adopted sustainable development as the centerpiece for global cooperation, what we're trying to do again 3 weeks from now. And yet somehow it didn't take, it didn't stick. What happened at the Rio Earth Summit was that 3 major multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, were signed. The 2 most famous of these were the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. These are both wonderful treaties. I have the privilege of teaching them each year to our incoming students in sustainable development. When you read them, you have to be impressed with what the world agreed on and the power of the, indeed the quality of the drafting and the statement of the principles. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change committed all countries to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate climate system by stabilizing the greenhouse gas concentrations.
Jeff, can I interrupt you for a moment? You have to give me a hint on which slide you are.
I'm sorry?
On which slide are you?
I'm still on the slide that says the idea of the SDGs.
Okay, and then if you want to have another slide, you just say slide, please.
I'll do that. Good.
You can delete the please, just slide.
Yeah. Thank you. So, these treaties were adopted, and when the governments came back in June 2012, Nature magazine gave a report card to the treaties. It's actually worth reading because it was a well-done article. The upshot of it was that all three treaties were given the grade of F, failing grade. Not one of them had been implemented. Here we have strong treaties on climate, on biodiversity, and on combating desertification. And by 2012, climate change was running out of control. Greenhouse gas concentrations were continuing to rise. The biodiversity was under what the ecologists estimate to be a 1,000-fold greater rate of extinction than in the background pre-industrial era. And the convention to combat desertification was basically nowhere to be seen. I don't think 1 in a million people even knows that the UN's CCD actually exists. And most of the dryland regions of the world, including the Middle East, are in growing degradation and massive disarray. And it is the drylands that are the source of huge amounts of the migration of people in the world, like the migration crisis that Europe is living through day by day. So the conferees in 2012 said, what's going on? And they looked over their shoulder at the Millennium Development Goals. Now, the Millennium Development Goals were quite different. They were focused on ending extreme poverty. They are not universal goals in the sense that they really apply to the poorest countries. They're less complex than the agenda of sustainable development, but they're not simple. And focusing attention on the world's poorest people, I can tell you, is not the easiest thing in the world to do. If there's one tendency of rich people or middle-income people trying to be rich, it's to turn their back on poor people. Poor people are nearly invisible in our world, except when disasters strike like the one that we're watching each day play out in the Middle East and in Europe right now, and of course in North Africa. So the Millennium Development Goals were not a multilateral treaty. They were a non-binding, non-legal instrument that aimed not at a technocratic, legalistic, diplomatic approach to poverty, but at a public mobilization of interest and awareness in the fight against poverty. They were also time-bound, 15 years. They stated specific quantified targets, interestingly, such as reducing the under 5 mortality rate by 2/3, or the maternal mortality rate in pregnancy and childbirth by 3/4, comparing the 2015 target year with the baseline of 1990. They called on the world to cut the rate of extreme poverty and hunger as mapped by the World Bank and the FAO, respectively, by half compared to the 1990 rate with the year 2015 target date. What happened, interestingly, was while the three multilateral environmental agreements, all legally binding, got tied up in diplomatic knots, the Millennium Development Goals had some measure of success. They attracted interest. Donors responded, at least partially, to these new goals. The IMF and World Bank adopted the HIPC-Epperly proposals to help make goals stick. New institutions like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria were given birth to help implement these goals, especially SDG 6, which that aren't working, but the MDGs, without all the lawyers and diplomats attached, seem to be capturing the public interest and the public mood. And therein was the origin of the SDGs in the outcome document of Rio Plus 20, a document with a wonderful title called The Future We Want. And a wonderful document. They called for new Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And they gave the UN General Assembly the assignment of coming up with these SDGs, and they said to do so by the end of 2015, by the time that the Millennium Development Goals would be finished. And indeed, the UN General Assembly has responded. And even the process of determining these new SDGs went in a way with much more global interest and diplomatic engagement than one might imagine. And perhaps even more remarkably, though the conference to adopt the SDGs is still more than 2 weeks away, the final outcome document is signed and sealed by the General Assembly. It's all been done. And that's very unusual for the UN. There's no late night sessions, no great neck negotiations. The world rather wants sustainable development goals. So if you go to the next slide, it says, I hope it says that the MDGs focused on fighting extreme poverty, the SDGs on sustainable development. Let me just underscore in one sentence that what the UN means by sustainable development is rather clear. It is that economic development should continue, combined with social inclusion and environmental sustainability. So it's a triple bottom line concept. In a way, I think it is a clearer and more operational definition than the one that Gurutha gave in the 1987 commission, which said that sustainable development means that each generation meets its needs in a manner that allows future generations to meet their needs. Rather than that intergenerational idea, the sustainable development concept adopted by the UN is a triple bottom line idea: economic, social, and environmental objectives in a holistic manner. So if you turn to the next slide, it emphasizes that extreme poverty has come down very sharply during the MDG era, and it remains the #1 SDG goal as well. The rate of poverty in the developing countries was estimated by the World Bank to be 43% in 1990. In 2010, it reached about 21%. This is extreme poverty. In other words, falling by more than half. By 2015, best estimates are that it's around 15% of the population of the developing countries. And now the goal for the new SDGs, SDG 1 in fact, is that it will reach 0 in effect, or close to 0 by the year 2030. But if you go to the next slide, the reason we need SDGs is that the triple bottom line is hardly being achieved right now. We have massive areas where clearly the global growth of the last generation has not been sustainable. On the one hand, inequalities have been rising markedly in many countries, including my own, and at the same time, of course, the environment has been degraded severely in an unprecedented manner and scale alongside economic growth. The next slide, which I'll just flash briefly, shows street protests across major cities of the world, really meant to convey the social unhappiness in many places in the world: high unemployment, rising inequalities, being targeted by the new Sustainable Development Goals. The next picture is the famous picture from Nature magazine in the next slide, from Nature magazine 2009, which I strongly recommend and subscribe to as our framework, and that's on the environmental side, the idea of planetary boundaries around 10 dimensions of Earth physical systems. The most important of these is climate change, perhaps accompanied with equal or even perhaps greater significance, but they're twin, biological diversity. But also we have stresses on all aspects of Earth systems, on pollution, on aerosols, on fresh water stress, on nitrogen and phosphorus loadings, on ocean acidification, on stratosphere and ozone depletion. And so because of the scale of human activity, which is now $106 trillion of gross world production at the current rate, we have put so much stress on the Earth's physical systems that we are crossing planetary boundaries not in one dimension like greenhouse gas emissions, or even two dimensions, including species decimation and the loss of biodiversity, but across these 10 different planetary boundaries. So the purpose of, you turn to the next slide, of the 17 SDGs is to have a holistic approach to 3 major pillars: economic development, including the end of extreme poverty; social inclusion, meaning gender equality, human rights, and the reduction of inequal systems. SDG 13, which is combating human-induced climate change; SDG 14, which is marine conservation and protection of ocean and marine ecosystems; and SDG 15, which is conservation and protection of terrestrial ecosystems. So these are the 3 big pillars. SDG 16, by the way, calls for peaceful and inclusive societies, and SDG 17 calls for the means to implement the 16 preceding Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there are 17 of these goals. I argued for 2 years that there should be no more than 10, then I said 12, and then, of course, the government said we're going to have 17. And I found out that with a little bit of practice, you can remember 17, so I'm learning to live with it, even though I still would have preferred a smaller number. There are a very large number of targets, 169 targets with these goals, but there's very clear statement in the concluding document that will be adopted on the 25th of September that these are indicative global goals that each country and each region needs to establish a prioritization among this large number so that there's a meaningful set of targets to implement the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The period of vigilance of the new SDGs will be January 1, 2016 to December 31st, 2030. These are universal goals. This is very important. Switzerland needs to achieve the SDGs. The United States needs to achieve the SDGs. The European Union needs to achieve the SDGs. These are not poverty goals. Poverty is part of it. To end extreme poverty, as I mentioned, is SDG number 1. But this is not about ending poverty. This is about sustainable development. And in this sense, as the document says, these goals are universal, indivisible, and interlinked. And that means they're for all of us. If you turn to the next slide, you have the icons that will be applied for these goals. These have been worked on for the past year rows of 6, where the lower right-hand column says Sustainable Development Goals. So in this sense, we have a nice visual opportunity. And then if you pass through the next slide to get to the one that says Sustainable Development Plans, let me talk about how we can take these goals seriously. If you read the goals and know them, they're rather sensible. They are bold, stretch goals. They are achievable technically. To achieve them, however, will require significant effort locally, nationally, and globally. In other words, we are not on a business as usual path to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But on the other hand, they're not fairy tales. They're not simply nice things. They are time-bound, time-defined objectives that are within reach. Let me highlight a few of them. First, end extreme poverty. That doesn't mean ending poverty, it means ending extreme poverty, as the World Bank defines it, being under $1.20 per person per day in 2005 purchasing power crisis. This is within reach, but it will require significant effort. SDG 7, for example, calls for universal access to modern energy services by 2030, that everybody should have access to electricity. As you know, there are about 1.5 billion people that do not have modern energy services, but the technologies, whether it's off-grid solar panels or expanding the power generation transmission, makes it possible to reach everybody. SDG 3, dear my heart and dear to Klaus Leisinger's heart and his leadership of so many years, is for universal health coverage. And I know there are many public health leaders in the room, and thank you. We made great progress on the MDGs, really tremendous progress on AIDS, TB, child survival, reduced maternal mortality. Not as much as we needed or could have done, but still very marked progress. Malaria, very difficult, fulminant disease to control, is down by around 70% since the MDGs were adopted. This is a historic achievement, and it comes from efforts by companies like Novartis, Sumitomo Chemical, and new global institutions like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, or the U.S. President's Malaria Initiative, working together, focused on MDG 6 to make this possible. We have a goal, SDG 4, which is universal secondary education by the year 2030. Again, when you think about low-income countries, many don't graduate more than 30% of their students. But we could, within 15 years, reach a what's called the school expectancy of at least high school completion, so that any child in school in 2030 in the lower or the secondary schools would have the very high expectation of completing a secondary education. All of this is within reach. But nothing is the current trajectory. In order for it to be the new trajectory, we need what I detailed here. I don't have time to elaborate, but basically we need plans. We need to be able to look ahead for 15 years to not forecast where we'll be in 2030, but backcast from 2030 what we need to be doing now in order to assure the success of each of the Sustainable Development Goals. I like very much what President John Kennedy said about goals in a famous speech he gave a little over a half century ago, that I wrote about in a book a couple of years ago, his famous peace speech. President Kennedy said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all peoples see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So President Kennedy's vision of leadership was to find a goal, say go to the moon and back by the end of the decade in the 60s, show that it's manageable through plans of action. Have people draw hope from that, and from that hope, move irresistibly toward the goals. And I found in my own experience of the MDGs that this is really the essence of achievement. Take a goal like reducing malaria mortality dramatically, which was set in the MDGs and Abuja in the year 2000. Make a plan of action. Be bold, but show that it's manageable. For many years, I argued the case for a mass distribution of insecticide-treated bed nets as key to that. That idea was finally accepted in 2007 by the WHO and then by the Secretary General in 2008. About 300 billion bed nets were distributed, and malaria is down by 70%, not just because of that, but because of other wonderful technologies as well, such as Novartis' provision of Coartem, the artemisinin-based drug of choice to cure malaria, because of Sumitomo Chemical produced and others produced world-class insecticide-treated bed nets, because of the spread of community health workers who could deliver these cures locally, because of the design of rapid diagnostic tests that made it so that we didn't need trained microscopists in rural areas, but could use an antigen testing strip at the doorstep of a household in a rural area. In other words, it was a marriage of technology, businesses ready to scale up, public financing, and a global goal that made it possible to have these breakthroughs. It is, in my view, living out President Kennedy's idea of take the bold goal, make it seem manageable by showing how it can be done, and then fight to implement it. Well, I don't have time to go through in detail by any means all the things I'd like to say about the national planning, but if you turn to the next slide, it says national plans must, and the main argument there is that they must take into account local context and operate by act passing. If you go to the next slide, it says One New York. That is a New York City Sustainable Development Plan that was just issued this spring. It's a 450-page or so document that focuses on integrated planning for economic, social, and environmental objectives, very much an SDG-oriented, city-based plan. The next slide shows China's 12th five-year plan is to remind us that in a lot of the world, countries have planning processes. China is about to adopt its 13th five-year plan next year. It's in preparation this year. These are serious opportunities to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals within the national plans. If you go to the next slide, it says Energy Strategy 2050. This is the Danish government's 40-year ahead plan on getting to a zero carbon energy system. A very well-done document showing why it is that Denmark can achieve the stretch goal of full decarbonization by 2050. And if you go to the next slide, it says Energy Roadmap 2050. That's the European Union's roadmap for an 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. Now, let me quickly close by a few points that I want to make in the next sections, but unfortunately, rather quickly, the next slide is technology, innovation, and the SDGs. The main point that I am sure is obvious to you, but needs emphasizing constantly to the public and the policy community. it means genomics, it means high technology agriculture. And all of this digital revolution, which is transforming every area of science and technology, from material science to energy, to renewable energy, to advanced healthcare, to new materials, sciences, and so forth, makes it possible to envision remarkable advances in low-cost solutions and in their rapid uptake. I'm very heartened by the fact, for example, that mobile phones basically came out of nowhere 30 years ago, it seemed, and now have 7 billion subscribers, including ubiquitous coverage in the poorest countries. We know that these communications technologies scale remarkably. They provide a platform for the massive uptake of other technologies as well. For each of the Sustainable Development Goals, if you go to the next slide, I urge that we compare a BAU or business as usual path with an SD or Sustainable Development path. I give an example of the next slide, but I don't really have time for it right now, of decarbonization. And part of what the SDGs invite us to do is to have every country prepare pathways of deep decarbonization. And I'm hoping that that concept of deep decarbonization pathways gets implemented actually within the agreement in Paris at the end of the year, so that we have a tool that every government is obligated to follow up on, to explore how each country is to achieve deep decarbonization. But that's the kind of manageability, becoming specific, by showing that these goals are not remote, but are manageable and can be made precise through rollouts of technology, that I think are the ways that these SDGs can be accomplished. So I don't have time because of the rapid hazard of time and my slow walk to go on, but if you flip through the slides to one that says, consider how to achieve universal health coverage. I just want to say a word about that.
I have it.
Okay, good. So if you go to the next slide, you will see a phone in the hands of a community health worker in Africa, actually in one of the Millennium Villages, where she's using a smartphone to log in data from a visit to one of the households in the village. The point I really want to make is that SDG 3 and SDG 4, SDG 3 being universal health coverage, and SDG 4 being universal quality education, and specifically going from pre-kindergarten through secondary education for all children, is achievable because of the information and communications technology platform. Ericsson estimates that by the year 2020, wireless broadband will cover well more than 90% of the population. If we choose to use this information platform and we design targeted applications for universal health coverage, for ICT, for training, for education, for classroom use, I believe that we have the technologies within reach, not in hand, but within reach to make spectacular breakthroughs in the same way that it was the confluence of coartem, rapid diagnostics,
You? Yes.
Good. So I have a theory which I would like you to subscribe to, and not just subscribe to, but partner with. And that is that we can use the global network of universities, University of Basel, my own university, Columbia University, and 1,000 universities around the world, to be an active network to help governments, business, and civil society to chart out the pathways to success, sustainable development, and also to be the incubators for the rapid development and then rapid fusion of sustainable development technologies. So I'm thinking that here we have universities around the world, great universities like yours, that really should be in the lead of finding the technical solutions to achieve these goals. And I can tell you in the low-income countries, this is not a normal process. Universities are not viewed primarily in many, many parts of the world as problem solvers. They're not viewed as partners of government and business. Of course, in Europe and the United States, we have a longer tradition of that. But in many parts of the world, universities are viewed as, at best, education centers, and at worst, cost centers and areas of disruption. And what I believe is vital for success of the SDGs is a worldwide university network for each part of the world, every city, every nation, every region, to work with governments to bring technical expertise to bear, to say we find pathways to universal secondary education, to universal health coverage, to decarbonization of the energy system, to protecting the marine and the terrestrial ecosystems, to closing the waste loop of our industries or of our cities so that we have a closed cycle or circular economy for the management of what are now wastes at the city level. And this idea, I think, is attractive not only in that it can lead to a great intensification of problem solving, but it's something of great interest for leaders around the world. They're understanding more and more that universities are not only education centers, but they're actually engines of the economy, because the innovation hubs that are the main drivers of growth in the world are organized around the universities. So if you think around Silicon Valley with the University of California, Berkeley, and Stanford, and University of California in San Francisco, or you think about Napa Valley in California with its close association with the University of California at Davis, and 100 other examples around the world in Europe and the United States and in Northeast Asia, of Japan, Korea, and China. You have ecosystems of university-led development around innovation that I think can become a catalyst for a much more rapid spread of this approach and idea in today's developing countries. There's a lot to do. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, with around a billion people now, and 950 million of them in tropical sub-Saharan Africa, in tropical sub-Saharan Africa, there isn't one university that's ranked in the top 500. If you add in South Africa, there are 4 in the top 500. But clearly you have a continent that is desperately in need of creating innovation hubs, training for the local application and uptake of information, but agronomic excellence, but building around the universities. And what I want to close with is immediately upon the Rio Plus 50 summit. And that is the idea of creating a network of problem solving of the world's universities, which we call the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. It operates under the auspices of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Bob Schleisinger is on the leadership council of that, and I may have other colleagues in the group as well that are active in the SDSN. But the idea is that the universities can step forward and say that we have a means of contributing in a notable and I would say unique way to the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you go a few slides further, there will be a world map with pins attached that is labeled members of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. There are now around 350 universities worldwide that are in the network. We have many national and regional forums for the Mediterranean Basin, for the Amazon, for Korea, for China, for Japan, for Southeast Asia, for Oceania, and so forth. And these are the beginning efforts to create this worldwide, very rich and very active network of leading, especially universities, but also research institutions around the world, to step forward and say, in this complex agenda of sustainable development, and with time-bound sustainable development goals, we are ready to do our part, to assume our part of leadership, and to cooperate with other parts of society for success. Please help, please join the network, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I will ask the audience now to put some questions forward to you. Two volunteers.
Janet Herring, Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. One of the initiatives that we're partnering in with the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne is for the massively open online courses. And there's a special emphasis from FFL and other Francophone universities, the RECIF initiative, to reach out to Francophone Africa. How do you see the MOOCs and that type of ICT advances as playing a role, for example, in your sustainability network?
Great. Thanks, Lon. The echo's a little bit bad, but I think you were asking about the role of MOOCs.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
As particularly in French-speaking Africa, because there's a link to the University of Lausanne.
Sorry?
Yeah, it's the MOOCs for Sub-Saharan Africa, the role of MOOCs for Sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so I'm a big believer in online education. I'm a big believer in the kind of meeting that we're having right now because it gives us the capacity to have a group brainstorming with so much greater facility than in the past. And I have been happy with the experience that I've had putting my own course online. The Age of Sustainable Development went online as a MOOC, I think about 2.5 years ago. It's been running something like 30,000 students per semester since then. It gets a good reach, therefore. It's, of course, very easy for me. I simply have to take it once, and it can play semester after semester, and people are interested, and it's for free, which I think is the best part of it. So I think that if we also partner to make sure that there's excellent materials online for free, and if we continue to innovate in local classrooms or e-mentoring or partnering students across international all over the world. And I know that for our own teaching in Columbia, the fact that one can easily have a lecturer from any part of the world, the one you really want on a particular subject, is of course a great benefit. But I do think that we should put up a free online university in sustainable development, hopefully one that figures out some of the issues so that students can get some kind of accreditation, can certainly use that for their job market, but also have the access for free to this subject matter.
Jeff, I will put the access to your online course on sustainable development to the audience here so that they, if they don't know it yet, can dial in. Are there other questions? Yes,
Good afternoon, Jeff, or good morning. This is Fatumata, the Executive Director of Rollback Malaria. Thank you very much for making the link between malaria and sustainable development goals, because we look at malaria as a gateway for sustainable development. You've shown how it has been done with malaria and how other sectors can do the same thing. And particularly looking at the 17 goals, you can see the link between malaria and all the goals as you've nicely done it with the economic growth, but also with environment and the social dimensions. So I would think that through the Sustainable Development Goals, we can accelerate and achieve the fight against malaria. For the colleague who talk about the moves, I think that the social movement that has led to accelerating malaria control can also be used for universities and democratize it and ensuring that all are volunteering and pushing forward to ensuring that really there is a great social movement for education and for accessing to knowledge and innovative tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for all your leadership. I think we should all give you a round of applause for all that you do. And also for us, if we can give us a round.
thank you.
You also played a huge role in the uptake of malaria treatment and also fighting leprosy down to almost complete eradication, but effectively full elimination. So these are great accomplishments. I think what's important for me in this, for everybody to understand, is that whenever you start with a goal, like let's eliminate leprosy or let's get malaria deaths down sharply, the first thing you're going to be told is, no, that's not possible. Don't be silly. This is stupid. And don't be such a dreamer. The world is dominated by cynics, by the way. And this is our biggest problem. If we could get the cynics out of the way, we'd actually have pretty clear sailing. But we're constantly fighting to tell people what's possible, and most of the time you hear, no, it's not possible, no, it's not possible. And going back to the year 2000 with malaria, we had a summit in Abuja with the then President Olusegun Obasanjo, every few months, and that wasn't working, actually. And I remember the president of the CEO of Sumitomo Chemical asking me, well, Mr. Sachs, we have the nets, how many should we produce? We would scale up to 1 million units. And I said, Mr. Yanagura, I'm afraid you're going to have to be producing 25 to 30 million units, not 1 million units. This is big stuff. We're going to full scale. And he looked at me a little bit like I was crazy, and I felt a little sorry for him. But they went up to the 30 million production. And that's what made it possible to distribute hundreds of millions of bed nets in recent years. So what I want to say is the following. We need to take the goals seriously. It's my most important message. In other words, the goal is not better health care. The goal is universal health coverage. The goal is not more education. The goal is universal secondary education. The goal is not something about climate change. The goal is stay below 2 degrees Celsius, meaning that we must decarbonize the energy system. In other words, these are not merely nice things. These are quantified objectives that force us to a different kind of thinking, a different kind of planning, a different scale of ambition. But they are absolutely within reach. These are not to devote half our income to this. This is a few percent of our world output. If devoted properly to this, will yield a success. But our mindset has to be bold. It has to be leapfrogging. It has to be technologically transformative. And it has to be to take the endpoint seriously and not to say we can't do it, but to say, how can we do it? I know even, actually I'll just make a little example, but not as an invidious example, but with UNESCO right now, which is a great leader in education. They're very worried that the goal is universal secondary education. They say that's too hard, Jeff. Let's have universal lower secondary education. And I say no, read the goal. It's universal secondary education, including upper. They say, oh God, how are we going to train enough teachers? How are we going to do this? Is it really realistic? And my argument is if we think about how to use information technology, if we think today how to empower Africa's universities to do this kind of massive scale up. In other words, if we take it seriously, we're going to discover a lot of things that are very cool, very good, very workable, and very fast. So that's the main message, and perhaps I'll end at that point. And back to you, Buzz.
Thank you so much. Jeff? Maybe the leadership message is also, let's not wait for the United Nations and the government and the city. Let's start tomorrow morning in our sphere of influence, because 7.2 billion small steps will also make a big difference. Thank you very much to New York, and see you soon.